Marcus Chen wiped the purple blood from his split lip as he picked himself up from the academy's crystalline floor. The Vorthax students around him chittered with what passed for laughter among their species, a sound like glass breaking in reverse. Their scaled faces showed the same expression they always wore when looking at him: disgust mixed with amusement. "The little pink thing bleeds the wrong color," hissed Kizoth, the largest of Marcus's tormentors. His crest flared bright orange with excitement. "Perhaps we should teach it more lessons about knowing its place." Marcus said nothing. At 16, he had learned that responding only made things worse. The Galactic Academy of Sciences was supposed to be a place where the brightest minds from across the galaxy gathered to learn. In practice, it was a place where alien students reminded the lone human daily that his species was considered barely above animals by most of galactic civilization. The irony wasn't lost on him. Humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 18 months ago, stumbling across it by accident during what was supposed to be a routine asteroid mining operation. The discovery had shocked the galaxy. Most species took centuries of careful development before achieving FTL travel. Humans had done it while trying to blow up a rock. The Galactic Council had been forced to acknowledge humanity's existence. But acknowledgement didn't mean respect. When they'd allowed exactly one human student to attend the academy, it had been more about keeping up appearances than any genuine belief in human potential. Marcus gathered his scattered data tablets and limped toward his dormitory. The academy's halls stretched impossibly high, designed for species that averaged 8 feet in height. Everything here made him feel small, which he suspected was intentional. The walls displayed flowing script in dozens of alien languages, but nothing in English. They didn't expect him to last long enough to matter. His room was a converted storage closet, literally. The accommodations office had been very clear about that when he'd arrived. Temporary measures, they'd said, though it had been temporary for 6 months now. Marcus didn't mind the size, but the constant rumble of the building's systems through the walls made sleep difficult. He activated his personal computer and began reviewing the day's lessons. Advanced xenobiology was proving particularly challenging. Not because the material was difficult, but because Professor Vexthal seemed to take personal offense at having a human in her class. Today's lecture on communication methods across species had been punctuated by frequent comments about primitive vocal cords and limited cognitive capacity. Marcus pulled up his notes on dragon linguistics, a subject that fascinated him, despite, or perhaps because of, the universal academic consensus that it was impossible. Dragons, the galaxy's most ancient and powerful species, spoke in mathematical patterns that no computer could decode and no living being could comprehend. Their language was said to be based on quantum harmonics that required a brain structure no other species possessed. For 3,000 years, the galaxy had tried to communicate with the dragons. Every attempt had failed spectacularly. Most resulted in the would-be translator being reduced to ash. The dragons themselves seemed content to ignore the younger species entirely, appearing only when their territorial boundaries were crossed or their hordes threatened. Marcus had been studying dragon linguistics for months, much to the entertainment of his professors. During his first week, he'd made the mistake of asking Professor Vexthal about dragon communication patterns. The lecture hall had erupted in what passed for laughter among the Keftari, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. "The human wants to understand dragon speech," Professor Vexthal had announced to the class. "Perhaps next it will want to understand the mathematics of star formation, or the poetry of neutron stars." But Marcus persisted. Something about the patterns in the recorded dragon vocalizations intrigued him. Where others heard random noise, he detected structure. Not the kind of structure that conventional linguistics expected, but structure nonetheless. His computer chimed with an incoming message. Marcus's heart sank when he saw the sender. Dean Morath, of the Diplomatic Studies Department. The dean was a Thurvian, with gray skin like granite and eyes that glowed a soft blue. He was also one of the few faculty members who didn't actively despise Marcus. "Student Chen," the message read, "please report to my office immediately. Urgent matter requires discussion." Marcus saved his work and headed through the academy's winding corridors. Other students pressed themselves against the walls as he passed, not out of respect but to avoid contamination. The prevailing belief among most galactic species was that humans carried diseases that could cross species barriers. This wasn't true, but fear rarely required truth. Dean Morath's office was located in the Academy's oldest tower, where the walls were still made of living crystal that pulsed with soft light. The dean sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single massive gemstone, reviewing holographic documents that shifted and flowed in 3 dimensions. "Sit," the dean said without looking up. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. Marcus settled into the chair across from the desk, which was designed for beings much larger than himself. His feet dangled like a child's. "There's been a development," Dean Morath continued, finally meeting Marcus's eyes. "The Dragon Council has made contact." Marcus felt his breath catch. The Dragon Council hadn't initiated contact with any galactic government in over 400 years. When dragons wanted something from the younger species, they simply took it. Communication was considered beneath them. "What do they want?" Marcus asked. "That's the problem," the dean replied, manipulating his holographic display to show a recording. "No one knows. The message was delivered to the Galactic Council 3 hours ago. Listen." The recording began with a sound unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. It wasn't quite music, wasn't quite speech, but something that seemed to contain elements of both. Mathematical patterns flowed through harmonics that made his teeth ache. The sound lasted exactly 97 seconds, then ended abruptly. "Every linguist in the galaxy has been working on this," Dean Morath explained. "The Council has declared it a Class 1 emergency. If we can't understand what the dragons want, we have to assume it's a threat." Marcus listened to the recording 3 more times. Each repetition revealed new layers of complexity. Have they tried running it through the Keftari analytical matrices? First thing they attempted. The matrices overloaded and shut down. The Mentari tried their quantum processors, same result. It's as if the message is designed to resist conventional analysis. "What does this have to do with me?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew. Dean Morath's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. "The Council is desperate. They're asking for volunteers to attempt translation, species that might have a unique perspective." Marcus understood. When conventional wisdom failed, sometimes it was time to try the unconventional. And what was more unconventional than a human? "They want me to try translating a dragon message," Marcus said. "More than that," the dean replied. "If you volunteer, you'll be given full access to the Dragon Archive, every recording, every interaction, every failed translation attempt in galactic history, resources that even senior professors can only dream of accessing." The offer was staggering. The Dragon Archive was legendary, containing data collected over millennia. Access was restricted to the highest levels of galactic government and the most distinguished academics. "What's the catch?" Marcus asked. "If you fail, you'll be expelled from the Academy immediately. No appeals, no second chances." The Council made it clear that this is not an opportunity for academic tourism. Marcus considered the proposal. He was already failing most of his classes, not through lack of ability but because his professors graded him by impossible standards. Expulsion was probably inevitable anyway, but access to the Dragon Archive. "How long do I have?" he asked. 72 hours, Dean Morath replied. "The Council meets to discuss military options if no translation is provided by then. Military options against the dragons would be suicide. Everyone knew it, but politicians had to be seen taking action." Marcus thought about the patterns he'd been studying. The structures he thought he detected in dragon vocalizations. Maybe his human perspective could find something others had missed. "I'll do it," he said. Dean Morath nodded slowly. "I thought you might. The archive access codes will be transmitted to your personal system within the hour. Marcus, I hope you understand what you're risking." Marcus stood to leave, then paused. "Dean, why are you helping me?" The Thurvian's blue eyes seemed to brighten slightly. "Because sometimes, the impossible requires someone foolish enough to try." Marcus returned to his dormitory to find his computer already downloading terabytes of data from the Dragon Archive. The sheer volume was overwhelming, recordings dating back 3 millennia, analysis attempts by thousands of linguists, theoretical frameworks that had failed spectacularly. But as he began to dive into the material, Marcus noticed something interesting. Every previous attempt had approached dragon communication from the assumption that it followed patterns similar to other galactic languages. Complex grammatical structures, symbolic representation, cultural context. What if they were wrong? What if dragon communication was something else entirely? Marcus pulled up the newest recording and listened again. This time, he didn't try to hear language. Instead, he listened for something else, something that human pattern recognition might detect, where alien analysis had failed. The sound washed over him like a tide. And suddenly he heard it. Not words, not grammar, not even traditional meaning, but something else. Something that made his human brain tingle with recognition, music, mathematics, emotion. All combined in ways that conventional linguistics couldn't parse because it wasn't really language at all. It was something far more complex and far more simple than anyone had imagined. Marcus smiled for the first time in months. Maybe being the galaxy's least respected student was about to become an advantage. He had 71 hours to prove that sometimes the impossible just required a different kind of thinking, and if he failed, at least he'd go down trying to achieve something no one in galactic history had ever accomplished. The recording played again, and Marcus began to hear the patterns that would change everything. He spent the next several hours immersed in the archive, cross-referencing patterns and building a theory that would have been laughed out of any respectable linguistics conference. Dragons didn't speak in the way other species understood speech. They communicated through layered harmonics that combined mathematical principles with emotional resonance and temporal manipulation. It was like discovering that what everyone thought was noise was actually a symphony written in dimensions most species couldn't perceive. Marcus pulled up historical records of dragon encounters. In every case where communication had been attempted, the results had been catastrophic. Linguists had approached the task with conventional translation matrices, trying to force dragon vocalizations into familiar grammatical frameworks. But what if the dragons weren't trying to convey information in the way other species did? What if their communication was more like art? Or mathematics? Or both simultaneously? As dawn broke over the Academy's crystal spires, casting rainbow reflections through Marcus's small window, he realized he wasn't alone in his room. A figure stood in the shadows by his door. Kezoth, the Vorthax student who had bloodied his lip the day before. The human hasn't slept, Kezoth observed, his crest rippling with colors that suggested both curiosity and disdain. Working on something important. Little pink thing. Marcus minimized his displays quickly, but not quickly enough. Kezoth's predatory eyes caught the dragon linguistic patterns on the screen. Ah, Kezoth chittered, still playing with the impossible. When you fail, and you will fail, perhaps the Council will finally see that humans don't belong here. Why do you care so much about whether I succeed or fail? Marcus asked, surprising himself with the question. Kezoth's crest flared bright red. Because your species is a contamination. You stumbled into space by accident, contributed nothing to galactic civilization. And yet here you sit, taking resources meant for worthy students. And you're worried that I might actually accomplish something, Marcus realized. That would be inconvenient for your worldview. The Vorthax student stepped closer, his scaled hands clenching into fists. You think you're clever, human. But dragons have been speaking for millions of years before your species learned to make fire. The greatest minds in the galaxy have tried and failed. What makes you think a primitive mammal could succeed where they have not? Marcus stood up slowly, meeting Kezoth's gaze despite the significant height difference. Maybe because I'm not trying to force their communication into patterns that make sense to us. Maybe I'm trying to understand it on its own terms. Kezoth's laugh was like breaking glass. Philosophy from a monkey. How amusing. He turned to leave, then paused. When you fail, human, remember that your betters tried to warn you. After Kezoth left, Marcus secured his door and returned to his work. The Vorthax words had actually helped clarify something important. Every previous translation attempt had been made by species trying to understand dragons through the lens of their own communication methods. But dragons were older than all of them, more sophisticated in ways that conventional analysis couldn't measure. What if the key wasn't translation at all? What if it was resonance? Marcus pulled up the newest dragon message again, but this time he didn't just listen. He watched the spectral analysis, studied the mathematical relationships between the harmonics, and tried to understand not what the dragons were saying, but how they were thinking. The breakthrough came at hour 56 of his 72-hour deadline. He was exhausted, running on stimulant tablets and determination, when he noticed something in the wave patterns that made his human brain recognize a familiar structure. The dragons weren't speaking in linear sequence the way most species did. They were layering concepts in dimensional space, creating meaning through harmonic relationships that existed outside of time. It wasn't language, it was architecture. Architecture made of sound and mathematics, and something that felt almost like emotion but wasn't quite that either. Marcus began to understand why every translation attempt had failed. The other species had been trying to decode meaning sequentially. This sound means this concept. This pattern indicates this grammatical structure. But dragons thought in multiple dimensions, simultaneously. Their communication required a kind of pattern recognition that most galactic species simply didn't possess. But humans did. Humans had evolved to recognize complex patterns in incomplete data, to make intuitive leaps that more logical species found inexplicable. It was the same cognitive ability that had led them to discover FTL travel by accident, the ability to see connections where others saw only chaos. The message began to make sense, not in words, not in concepts that could be easily translated, but in terms of intent and meaning that bypassed conventional language entirely. The dragons weren't threatening the galaxy, they were offering it something, and they had specifically requested communication with humanity. Marcus stared at his analysis, hardly believing what he was seeing. After 3,000 years of failed attempts at dragon communication, they had finally made contact. And they wanted to talk to the species everyone else considered barely above animals. There was a reason for that, Marcus realized. Dragons weren't interested in communicating with species who thought in linear, logical patterns. They needed someone who could think in the same kind of multidimensional, intuitive way they did. They needed someone human. Marcus spent his remaining hours refining his understanding and preparing his presentation. When the 72-hour deadline arrived, he was ready to present something that would either revolutionize galactic civilization or get him thrown off the Academy grounds. Either way, it was going to be interesting. The council chamber was a massive sphere of polished obsidian that floated in the center of the Academy's most secure building. Representatives from 47 galactic species sat in concentric rings, their various breathing apparatuses, translation devices, and life support systems creating a symphony of mechanical sounds. At the chamber's center, a holographic display showed the mysterious dragon message in visual form, swirling patterns of color and mathematics that hurt to look at directly. Marcus stood at the presentation podium, acutely aware that every being in the chamber considered him an inferior life form. His hands trembled slightly as he activated his presentation materials, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Honored representatives," he began, the words echoing strangely in the chamber's acoustic dampening field. "I believe I have deciphered the dragon message." The chamber erupted immediately. Councillor Vexthal stood up, her tentacles writhing with agitation. "This is preposterous. The human child has been here for 72 hours. Teams of expert linguists have worked for centuries on dragon communication, and they've all failed," Marcus replied calmly. "Perhaps that should tell us something." "Come," Grand Councillor Morthok, a massive creature whose species resembled a cross between a bear and a crystal formation, raised one enormous hand. The chamber fell silent. "Speak, human. What do you claim to have discovered?" Marcus took a deep breath and activated his first display. Every previous attempt to understand dragon communication has assumed that dragons think like we do, linearly, logically, sequentially. But they don't. Dragons exist in multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. Their language isn't about conveying information from one mind to another. It's about creating shared mathematical experiences that exist outside normal space-time. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several representatives activated their translation devices, apparently convinced they had misunderstood something. Explain this mathematical experience, demanded Councillor HFY of the Keftari Union. Marcus activated his second display, showing the spectral analysis of the dragon message. Watch the harmonic relationships. See how they layer and interact? This isn't language as we understand it. It's architecture. The dragons are building conceptual structures using sound and mathematics as their materials. Impossible, declared Professor Vexthul. No being can process information in multiple temporal dimensions. It would require a brain structure that evolution cannot produce. Human evolution is different, Marcus said quietly. We developed pattern recognition abilities that allowed us to survive on a predator-filled world. With limited natural defenses, we learned to make intuitive leaps, to see connections in incomplete data, to think around problems rather than through them. He paused, looking around the chamber at the alien faces staring back at him. Some showed skepticism, others confusion. But a few, including Grand Councillor Morthok, seemed to be listening with genuine interest. The dragons aren't trying to tell us something in their message. They're showing us something, and what they're showing us is an invitation. An invitation to what? Asked the Grand Councillor. Marcus activated his final display, and the chamber gasped. The seemingly chaotic patterns of the dragon message had been transformed into a stunning three-dimensional map, a star chart showing the location of a system near the galactic core. They want to meet with us, Marcus said. But not with our governments or our military leaders. The message specifically requests communication with humanity. They're inviting our species to meet with them at these coordinates. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives from dozens of species began shouting simultaneously, their translation devices creating a cacophony of overlapping voices. Several councillors demanded Marcus be arrested for spreading dangerous misinformation. Others called for immediate verification of his claims. Grand Councillor Morthak's voice boomed over the chaos. Silence. The chamber fell quiet instantly. Human, the Grand Councillor continued. You claim the dragons have specifically requested communication with your species. Why would the galaxy's oldest civilization be interested in its newest? Marcus had been hoping to avoid this question, but he'd known it would come. Because we think like they do, not in terms of logical progression or rational analysis, but through pattern recognition and intuitive understanding. Dragons have been trying to communicate with galactic civilization for millennia, but they needed to wait for a species that could actually understand them. This is absurd, Councillor Vexthul hissed. You're suggesting that a species that discovered space travel by accident is somehow more sophisticated than civilizations that have existed for millions of years. Not more sophisticated, Marcus corrected, just different. Sometimes you need a different kind of thinking to solve a problem that conventional approaches can't handle. Grand Councillor Morthok studied the star chart that Marcus had generated. Even if your translation is correct, and that remains to be verified, sending humans to meet with dragons would be incredibly dangerous. Dragons have destroyed entire fleets that violated their space, which is exactly why they want to meet with humans, Marcus realized, the insight hitting him as he spoke. We're not a threat to them. We don't have vast military fleets or aggressive expansion policies. We're not trying to conquer them or exploit them. We're just curious. The truth of it settled over the chamber like a weight. Every other species in galactic civilization had approached dragons from a position of either fear or ambition. Humans were the first species that might actually meet them as equals, not because they were powerful, but because they were genuinely interested in understanding rather than exploiting. This is a trick, declared Councillor HFY. Dragons do not invite communication. They destroy those who attempt it. Maybe because until now, no one has been able to actually communicate, Marcus suggested. Maybe they've been waiting for someone who could understand what they're really saying. Dean Morath stood up in the gallery where Academy faculty were seated. If I may, Grand Councillor, I would like to offer some context. Student Chen has been studying dragon linguistics for months, despite significant discouragement from his professors His approach has been unconventional from the beginning. Unconventional because it's wrong, Professor Vex Thul interjected. Or unconventional because conventional approaches have failed for 3,000 years. Dean Morath replied smoothly. Grand Counselor Morthok manipulated the holographic display, examining Marcus's translation from multiple angles. The mathematical relationships are consistent, he admitted grudgingly. The harmonic patterns do create the spatial coordinates, when viewed as architectural structures rather than linguistic ones. But even if the translation is accurate, said Counselor Zhexhai, we cannot simply send humans to meet with dragons. The risk is too great. The risk of not going might be greater, Marcus said. They made contact for a reason. If we ignore their invitation, we might not get another chance. And if you're wrong, Counselor Vex Thul pointed out, we could be responsible for the extinction of humanity's first generation of space travelers. Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Everything he'd worked for, everything humanity might achieve in space, hung on his translation of a message that no one else had been able to understand. But as he looked around the chamber at the alien faces watching him, he realized something important. They were all afraid. Every species represented here had encountered dragons at some point in their history, and every encounter had ended badly for them. They were projecting their own fear onto his translation. I volunteer to go, Marcus said quietly. The chamber fell silent. I volunteer to be part of the contact team, he continued, his voice growing stronger. If my translation is wrong, I should be the one to pay the price. But if it's right, if the dragons really want to meet with humanity, then we need to respond. Grand Counselor Morthok studied Marcus for a long moment. You would risk your life on your interpretation of a message that every expert in the galaxy has deemed impossible to translate. Yes, Marcus said without hesitation. And if you're wrong? Marcus thought about Kizoth and the other students who had spent months reminding him that humans didn't belong in space. He thought about the professors who graded his work by standards no human could meet. He thought about the storage closet that served as his dormitory, and the constant message that his species was nothing more than an amusing accident. If I'm wrong, he said, at least I'll die trying to prove that humans can contribute something meaningful to galactic civilization. The Grand Counselor was quiet for several minutes, consulting with advisors through private communication channels. Finally, he spoke. The Council will consider your proposal. In the meantime, you will remain under protective custody while experts verify your translation methodology. As security escorts approached his podium, Marcus caught sight of Dean Morath in the gallery. The Thurvian gave him what might have been an encouraging nod. Marcus had done something unprecedented. He had potentially cracked a mystery that had puzzled the galaxy for millennia. Whether that would lead to humanity's greatest triumph or its most catastrophic failure remained to be seen. But as the security escorts led him from the chamber, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months at the academy. Hope. For the first time since arriving at the institution, he had proven that human thinking could solve problems that alien logic couldn't handle. The real test would come when they discovered whether the dragons were interested in conversation or conquest. Marcus hoped his translation was accurate. Because if it wasn't, he had just volunteered himself, and possibly his entire species for extinction. But if it was right, if the dragons really wanted to communicate with humanity, then everything was about to change. The chamber doors sealed behind him with a sound like thunder, but Marcus could still hear the shouting voices of representatives trying to decide humanity's fate. In a few hours, he would learn whether his greatest academic achievement would become his species' greatest opportunity or its final mistake. Either way, the ridicule was about to end. One way or another, everyone would know whether the human boy had actually accomplished the impossible. The detention chamber was more comfortable than Marcus's dormitory room, which said something about the academy's priorities. The walls were smooth metal rather than living crystal, and the furniture was actually sized for beings his height. A small window looked out over the academy's landing bays, where ships from dozens of worlds came and went in a constant stream of interstellar traffic. Marcus had been there for 6 hours when Dean Morath arrived, carrying a datapad and wearing an expression that was difficult to read on his granite features. They've verified your translation methodology, the dean said without preamble. 3 independent teams of expert linguists worked through your process. 2 of them think you're completely wrong. 1 thinks you might be onto something. Which one? Marcus asked. The team from the Mentari Collective. They specialize in non-linear communication systems. Dean Morath settled into the chair across from Marcus. Dean Morath settled into the chair across from Marcus. More importantly, they ran your translated coordinates through the Deep Space Monitoring Network. Marcus leaned forward. And? There's been unusual quantum disturbance activity in that system for the past month. Something large moved through the area recently, large enough to disrupt space-time in measurable ways. The implications hit Marcus immediately. If something had moved through the system after the dragon message was sent, it could be evidence that they were indeed planning to meet there. Does the Council believe me now? The Council is terrified, Dean Morath replied bluntly. Half of them think you've discovered a dragon invasion plan. The other half think you've misinterpreted a territorial warning. Almost none of them believe your theory about an invitation. But you do, Marcus realized, studying the Dean's expression. I think you've accomplished something remarkable, the Thurvian said carefully. Whether that's a breakthrough in dragon communication or an elaborate misunderstanding remains to be seen. Marcus stood and walked to the window. Below, a massive cargo ship from the hegemony was taking off, its engines creating aurora-like effects in the atmosphere. What happens now? The Council has authorized a reconnaissance mission to the coordinates you provided. They're sending a small fleet to observe from a safe distance. Without me, the Council considers you too valuable to risk, Dean Morath explained. If your translation is correct, they want you available for further communication attempts. Marcus turned from the window. And if I'm wrong? Then they want you available to help clean up the diplomatic disaster. Before Marcus could respond, alarms began echoing through the Academy's corridors. The lights in his chamber shifted to emergency amber, and the window's view was suddenly filled with ships moving in urgent formation. Dean Morath activated his communication device. Morath here. What's the situation? A voice crackled through the device, speaking in rapid galactic standard. All faculty to emergency stations. Dragon fleet detected in the Xerion system. Multiple vessels, massive energy signatures. They're heading for Council space. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. Xerion was the system he had identified in the dragon message. They're early, he whispered. Or your translation was wrong and this is an attack. Dean Morath said grimly. No, Marcus said, certainty filling his voice. They're coming because they expected us to be there. When we didn't show up, they decided to come to us. The implications were staggering. If the dragons had interpreted the lack of human response as rejection or hostility, the galaxy might be about to witness the first dragon military action in 4 centuries. I have to get to the Council chamber, Marcus said. You're in protective custody. Dean, if I'm right about their communication, then the dragons are coming here because they think we ignored their invitation. They might be planning to deliver their message in person. The alarm continued to wail as Dean Morath processed this possibility. And if they're coming in person to deliver a message, they'll expect to communicate with someone who can understand them, Marcus finished. Someone, human. Dean Morath made a decision that probably violated a dozen Council protocols. Come on. We're going to the command center. They moved through corridors filled with panicking students and faculty. Emergency shuttles were evacuating non-essential personnel to the system's outer planets, while military vessels took defensive positions around the Academy. Marcus noticed that most of the fleeing ships were heading away from the galactic core, the direction the dragons were approaching from. The command center was a massive chamber filled with holographic displays showing real-time data from across the galaxy. Admiral Thexpol, a Vorthok military commander whose crest was flaring bright red with stress, stood at the center of the chaos. Dragon fleet has been confirmed in 17 systems. He was reporting to an emergency council session. Estimated arrival at council space in 4 hours. Fleet composition unknown. But energy signatures suggest vessels larger than anything in our databases. How many ships? Asked Grand Counselor Morthok. That's difficult to determine, Admiral Thexpole admitted. The energy signatures are interfering with our sensors. It could be 3 ships or 300. Marcus stepped forward, despite the Admiral's obvious surprise at seeing a human in the command center. Admiral, are the ships showing any hostile behavior? Who authorized this human's presence? The Admiral demanded. I did, Dean Morath said firmly. He's the one who translated the original dragon message. Admiral Thexpole's crest flickered between anger and confusion. To answer your question, human, the ships are maintaining formation and steady course. No weapon signatures detected, but with dragon technology, that means nothing. Marcus studied the holographic displays showing the dragon fleet's approach vector. They're following standard diplomatic approach protocols, he realized. Look at their formation, it's the same pattern the Mentari use when requesting audience with the Council. Dragons don't follow diplomatic protocols, Admiral Thexpole said dismissively. They do when they want to communicate, Marcus insisted. This isn't an invasion. They're coming to deliver their message because we didn't respond to their invitation. The command center fell quiet as everyone processed this interpretation. It made sense, but it also meant that the galaxy's most powerful civilization was approaching because they felt ignored. If you're correct, Grand Counselor Morthak said over the communication system, what do you propose we do? Marcus looked around the chamber at the alien faces staring at him. Military commanders, government officials, and academic leaders all waiting for a 16-year-old human to provide a solution to a crisis that could reshape galactic civilization. We meet them, Marcus said simply. We send a ship to intercept their fleet and open communication. We show them that we understood their message and were willing to talk. Absolutely not, Admiral Thexpole declared. We will not send ships into range of dragon weapons based on a human child's interpretation of their intentions. Then we let them arrive at the academy, Marcus replied. And we hope they're still interested in conversation when they get here. The debate that followed was intense but brief. Time was running out, and decisions had to be made. In the end, it was Grand Counselor Morthak who proposed the compromise that everyone could accept. We will send a single ship to intercept the dragon fleet, he announced. A diplomatic vessel with minimal crew and no weapons. If the dragons are truly interested in communication, they will not harm an unarmed ship approaching under diplomatic protocols. And if they are planning an attack? Admiral Thexpole asked. Then we will have our answer, the Grand Counselor replied grimly. Marcus felt his heart racing as he realized what he had to say next. I should be on that ship. The command center erupted in protests, but Marcus continued. If my translation is correct, they want to communicate with humans specifically. I'm the only person who has successfully decoded their communication method. If we're going to establish contact, it has to be me. Unacceptable risk, Admiral Thexpole stated flatly. Greater risk is not trying, Marcus countered. If the dragons wanted to destroy us, they would have done it already. They're coming here because they want something from us. We need to find out what. Grand Counselor Morthak was quiet for a long moment, weighing the options. Finally, he spoke. Prepare a diplomatic vessel, minimal crew, standard protocols, and include the human on the manifest. Marcus felt a mixture of terror and excitement as the decision was made. In 2 hours, he would be aboard a ship heading directly toward a dragon fleet. He would either make first contact with the galaxy's oldest civilization or become the shortest-lived diplomat in galactic history. But as he watched the preparations begin, Marcus realized that the ridicule had already ended. Whatever happened next, he had proven that human thinking could solve problems that alien logic couldn't handle. Now he just had to survive long enough to see whether his solution would save the galaxy or doom it. The diplomatic vessel times Harmony's edge times was smaller than Marcus had expected, designed more like a luxury transport than a military ship. Its crew consisted of Ambassador Veltar from the Mentari Collective, Captain Joss of the Hegemony Navy, 3 communication specialists, 2 cultural attachés, and 1 very nervous human teenager. Marcus sat in the observation lounge, watching the stars shift as they approached the dragon fleet. Through the reinforced windows, He could see distant lights that grew larger and more imposing with each passing minute. The dragon ships were unlike anything in galactic databases, organic-looking curves that seemed to flow like living metal. Surfaces that shifted color as they moved through space. Magnificent, breathed Dr. Kexhai, one of the communication specialists. I've studied dragon technology for decades, but seeing it in person. Focus on staying alive to study it longer, Captain Joss suggested dryly. The hegemony officer was a pragmatist, who had made it clear he thought this mission was elaborate suicide. Ambassador Veltar floated near the command console, his crystalline form pulsing with soft bioluminescence. The Mentari communicated through controlled chemical reactions in their transparent bodies, which made them excellent at understanding nonverbal communication forms. "Human Marcus," he said, his voice like wind chimes. "Are you prepared for first contact protocols?" Marcus nodded, though his hands were shaking slightly. They had practiced the communication sequence dozens of times during the journey, but theory and practice were very different when facing beings who could destroy their ship with a thought. "Dragon Fleet is responding to our approach," reported the navigation officer. They're forming a reception pattern. On the main display, the dragon ships were indeed moving into a formal arrangement, a spherical formation with an opening at one end, like an invitation to enter. "That's definitely a diplomatic formation," Ambassador Veltar observed. "They're welcoming us into their space." Note, Captain Joss looked skeptical. "Or they're surrounding us before they attack." "No," Marcus said, studying the pattern. "Look at the positioning. It's the same mathematical relationship I found in their communication. They're creating a harmonic structure in space, just like they do with sound." As the times harmony's edge times moved toward the opening in the dragon formation, Marcus activated the communication array they had prepared. Instead of trying to broadcast a traditional greeting, he transmitted a response using the same dimensional pattern structures he had identified in the original dragon message. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Sound filled the ship not through the speakers, but seeming to come from the walls themselves. From the air, from inside their bones. It was music and mathematics and meaning all combined into something that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the consciousness. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as the dragon communication washed over him. It wasn't words or concepts in any traditional sense, but pure meaning flowing from mind to mind. Welcome. Curiosity. Ancient patience finally rewarded. Joy at contact with minds that could understand. The other crew members were struggling to process the experience. Ambassador Veltar's crystalline form was cycling through colors so rapidly it hurt to look at. The communication specialists were frantically trying to record and analyze something that couldn't be captured by conventional means. "How are you understanding this?" Captain Joss demanded, his voice strained. "I'm not understanding it," Marcus replied, still tears on his cheeks. "I'm experiencing it. That's the difference." On the main display, one of the dragon ships was approaching a vessel so large it dwarfed the times harmony's edge times like a moon next to a pebble. Its surface rippled with patterns of light that matched the harmonic structures in the communication. "They want us to dock," Marcus realized. "They're inviting us aboard." "Absolutely not," Captain Joss said immediately. "That's suicide." "It's what we came here to do," Ambassador Veltar reminded him. "First contact requires contact." The debate was brief because the decision wasn't theirs to make. The dragon ship simply absorbed the times harmony's edge times into itself, drawing the smaller vessel through an opening that sealed seamlessly behind them. Marcus found himself standing in a docking bay that defied every law of physics he understood. The space seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, with walkways that curved through angles that shouldn't exist, and lighting that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then he saw them. Dragons. They were nothing like the artistic representations in galactic databases. They weren't reptilian monsters or fire-breathing beasts. They were beings of pure elegance, serpentine forms that flowed through space as if swimming through dimensions, scales that shifted color like oil on water, eyes that held the depth of galaxies. The largest dragon approached, moving without seeming to touch the ground. When it spoke, the words formed not in sound but directly in Marcus's mind. Asterisk young pattern singer. Asterisk it said, and Marcus somehow understood that pattern singer was what they called humans. Asterisk. You have accomplished something our kind thought impossible. Asterisk. What's that? Marcus managed to ask aloud. Asterisk. You have learned to hear the song of existence itself. Your species thinks in harmonies that we thought only we could perceive. Asterisk. Marcus felt the presence of other dragons gathering around them, their communication creating a symphony of meaning that flowed through dimensions he couldn't name. Ambassador Veltar and the others seemed to be experiencing something similar, though with less clarity than Marcus. Why did you want to meet with humanity specifically? Marcus asked. The dragon's response came with overtones of ancient sadness and sudden hope. Asterisk. For 3 million years, we have been alone in our understanding of the universe's deeper structures. We developed technology and philosophy that no other species could comprehend. We watched civilizations rise and fall, always hoping that one day we would find minds that could think as we think. Asterisk. Marcus began to understand the magnitude of what was happening. You've been waiting for us. Asterisk. Waiting for any species that could perceive reality as we do. Most galactic civilizations think in straight lines, in logical progressions, in cause and effect. But the universe is far more complex than that. It requires pattern recognition that transcends linear thought. Asterisk. And humans have that ability, Marcus realized. Asterisk. Your species evolved on a world that required constant adaptation, constant pattern recognition, constant intuitive leaps for survival. You developed minds that can perceive connections where others see only chaos. You are the first species we have encountered that might be capable of understanding what we truly have to offer. Asterisk. The implications were staggering. The dragons weren't just interested in communication, they were interested in partnership, in sharing knowledge and technology that could revolutionize galactic civilization. What do you want from us? Marcus asked. The dragon's response came with harmonics that spoke of vast possibilities. Asterisk. To teach and to learn. To share understanding that has been locked away for millennia, because no other species could comprehend it. To no longer be alone in the universe. Asterisk. Ambassador Veltar managed to speak, his voice struggling with the alien communication method. What would this partnership entail? Anna. The dragon turned its attention to the Mentari diplomat, and Marcus felt the communication shift to include the others more fully. Asterisk. We offer knowledge that your civilizations cannot currently imagine, technology that works with the fundamental structures of reality rather than against them, philosophy that could guide your species toward true understanding of existence. Asterisk. And in return? Captain Zoss asked skeptically. Asterisk. Companionship. Asterisk. The dragon replied simply. Asterisk. An end to the loneliness of being the only minds capable of perceiving the true nature of reality. Asterisk. Marcus felt the weight of the moment settling on him. This wasn't just first contact, this was a potential transformation of everything. The dragons were offering to share knowledge that could advance galactic civilization by millions of years. There's one problem, Marcus said. Most of the galaxy doesn't trust humans. They think we're primitive, dangerous, unreliable. The dragon's response carried undertones of amusement. Asterisk. The galaxy thinks in terms of military power and technological advancement. They measure worth by the size of fleets and the complexity of computers. But true advancement comes from understanding the patterns that underlie reality itself. In that measure, humanity is the most advanced species we have encountered. Asterisk. The conversation continued for hours, though time seemed to flow differently in the dragon ship. Marcus learned that the dragons had been watching humanity's development for decades, waiting to see if they would develop the kind of thinking that could comprehend dragon knowledge. The discovery of FTL travel through accident had been the final confirmation they needed. Only a species with truly advanced pattern recognition could stumble upon the fundamental shortcuts through space-time while trying to accomplish something else entirely. When it came time to return to the Time's Harmony's Edge asterisk, Marcus carried with him a recording device containing the framework for a new form of communication, one that could allow ongoing dialogue between dragons and humans. This changes everything, Ambassador Veltar said, as they prepared to return to Council space. Everything except the fact that most of the galaxy will reject it, Captain Joss pointed out. They won't accept that humans are anything special. Marcus thought about Kezoth and the other students who had spent months ridiculing him. He thought about the professors who had dismissed his work as impossible. He thought about the council representatives who had considered his translation absurd. Then we prove them wrong, he said simply. The journey back to the academy passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Marcus worked with the communication specialists to develop a presentation that could demonstrate the reality of human-dragon communication without revealing too much sensitive information. When they arrived at the academy, word of their successful contact had already spread throughout galactic civilization. The Times Harmony's Edge Times was met by a fleet of ships from every major species, all demanding to know what had transpired. In the council chamber, Marcus once again stood at the presentation podium. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The representatives who had dismissed him as a primitive human now watched with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. The dragons have made an offer, Marcus began, activating the recording device the dragons had provided. They want to share knowledge with galactic civilization, but they have specific requirements for how that sharing will take place. What requirements? Demanded Grand Counselor Morthok. Humanity will serve as intermediaries, Marcus replied. All communication with the dragons will go through human translators who can properly understand their communication methods. The chamber erupted in protests and demands for explanation. Marcus waited for quiet, then continued. The dragons have been alone for 3 million years because no other species could understand their way of thinking. Humans can. That makes us valuable in a way that has nothing to do with military power or technological advancement. Counselor Vex Thule stood up, her tentacles writhing with agitation. You expect us to accept that a species that discovered space travel by accident is somehow more sophisticated than civilizations that have existed for millions of years? I expect you to accept that different kinds of thinking solve different kinds of problems, Marcus replied. The dragons aren't interested in working with species that think like they already think. They want to work with species that think differently, species that can bring new perspectives to problems they've been wrestling with for eons. As the debate raged around him, Marcus realized that the ridicule had indeed ended. Not because he had proven himself to the aliens who had dismissed him, but because he had proven something far more important. He had proven that humanity had something unique to offer the galaxy. Something that couldn't be measured in weapons or ships or technological advancement, but was perhaps more valuable than all of those combined. The galaxy's most ancient and powerful civilization had chosen to work with humanity not despite their differences from other species, but because of them. Marcus smiled as he listened to the arguments and negotiations that would reshape galactic civilization. The human boy who had been ridiculed for trying to understand dragon communication was about to become the first ambassador to a civilization that could transform everything. And somewhere in the star system, where it all began, dragons waited patiently to begin teaching their new partners about the deeper patterns of existence itself. The impossible had become inevitable, and it all started with a human who refused to accept that some things couldn't be understood. Over the following weeks, as the implications of the Dragon Alliance became clear, Marcus found his life transformed in ways he had never imagined. The storage closet that had served as his dormitory was replaced with quarters in the Academy's most prestigious residential tower. Professors who had once dismissed his work now competed to collaborate with him on research projects. But the most significant change came when Kezoth approached him in the Academy's main courtyard. The Vorthak student's crest was a subdued blue-green as he stopped in front of Marcus, a color that indicated uncertainty and something approaching respect. Human, Kezoth said, his voice lacking its usual mocking tone. I owe you an apology. Marcus looked up from the advanced dragon linguistics texts he had been studying. For what? For everything, Kezoth replied. For assuming your species was primitive, for treating you as inferior, for not understanding that intelligence takes many forms. Marcus closed his book and studied the alien student who had made his life miserable for months. What changed your mind? Kezoth's crest shifted to deeper blue. My government has assigned me to study human cognitive patterns. They want to understand how your species thinks, so they can better work with the Dragon Alliance. I've been reading reports of human achievements, studying your history, analyzing your problem-solving methods. And I realize that we were wrong about everything," Kezoth admitted. "Your species doesn't think like ours. But that doesn't make you inferior. It makes you different, valuable. You solve problems we can't solve precisely because you approach them differently." Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and pity. "It took a dragon alliance to make you realize that?" "Yes," Kezoth said simply. "And that makes me ashamed. We should have recognized your worth long before the dragons forced us to acknowledge it." The conversation was interrupted by Dean Morath, who approached carrying a formal-looking document. "Marcus, I have news that should interest you." "What kind of news?" Marcus asked. "The Galactic Council has established the Institute for Dragon-Human Cooperative Studies," the Dean explained. "They want to formalize the relationship between our species and the dragons. They've offered you the position of director." Marcus stared at the document. A week ago, he had been a failing student living in a storage closet. Now he was being offered leadership of one of the most important research institutions in galactic history. "There's more," Dean Morath continued. "The dragons have requested that the institute be located on Earth. They want to work directly with humanity in its home environment." The implications hit Marcus immediately. Earth would become the center of dragon-human cooperation, making his home planet one of the most important worlds in galactic civilization. Humanity would go from being barely acknowledged newcomers to being essential partners in the galaxy's most advanced research. "Why Earth?" Marcus asked. "According to the dragon communication I received this morning," Dean Morath replied, "they believe that human creativity and intuition are enhanced by your natural environment. They want to experience the world that shaped the minds they've been waiting 3 million years to find." Marcus thought about his home world, the chaotic, dangerous, beautiful planet that had forced humanity to develop the pattern recognition abilities that the dragons valued so highly. Earth, with its unpredictable weather, diverse ecosystems, and constant environmental challenges that had shaped human evolution. "They want to understand us as much as we want to understand them," Marcus realized. "More than that," Dean Morath said. "They want to learn from us. The dragons have knowledge that could advance every aspect of galactic civilization. But they've been isolated by their own superiority for so long that they've lost touch with certain kinds of thinking. They need human perspectives to continue their own development." Over the following months, Marcus watched as the galaxy transformed around the new alliance. The Institute for Dragon-Human Cooperative Studies became a reality, with facilities on Earth and research stations throughout human space. Dragons began sharing knowledge that revolutionized everything from faster-than-light travel to medical technology to artistic expression. But the changes went deeper than technology. The Dragon Alliance forced every species in the galaxy to reconsider their assumptions about intelligence, value, and worth. Humanity's rapid rise from overlooked newcomers to essential partners challenged the established hierarchies that had governed galactic civilization for millennia. Marcus returned to Earth for the Institute's opening ceremony, where he stood before an audience that included representatives from every major galactic civilization and 3 ancient dragons who had chosen to take physical forms that smaller beings could comfortably interact with. As he looked out at the assembled crowd, Marcus remembered the day he had first listened to dragon vocalizations in his cramped dormitory room. He thought about the months of ridicule and dismissal, the professors who had laughed at his theories, the students who had treated him as barely worthy of notice. 6 months ago, he began his speech, I was considered the least promising student at the Galactic Academy. My professors thought I was wasting time studying impossible problems. My classmates treated me like a primitive curiosity. I lived in a storage closet because no one expected me to last long enough to need real quarters. The audience was silent, listening intently. Today, I stand here as director of an institute that will reshape our understanding of the universe itself. Not because I became smarter, not because I proved myself worthy by their standards, but because someone finally recognized that different kinds of thinking solve different kinds of problems. He paused, looking directly at the dragon representatives. The dragons didn't choose to work with humanity because we're the most advanced species in the galaxy. They chose us because we think differently than anyone else. Because our chaotic, intuitive, pattern-seeking minds complement their ancient wisdom in ways that create new possibilities. Marcus activated a holographic display showing the comparative development timelines of major galactic civilizations. Every species represented here has achieved remarkable things through logical progression, careful planning, and systematic advancement. But sometimes the most important discoveries come from approaches that seem illogical, accidental, or impossible. Humanity discovered FTL travel by accident while trying to mine asteroids. We solved 3,000-year-old dragon communication problems by ignoring conventional linguistics entirely. We approached the universe with curiosity instead of caution, with intuition instead of just logic, with the willingness to fail spectacularly in pursuit of understanding. The holographic display shifted to show the technological and philosophical advances already emerging from dragon-human cooperation. New forms of mathematics that described reality in ways no single species had conceived, technologies that worked with the fundamental patterns of existence rather than against them. The galaxy is about to enter a new age, Marcus continued. Not because one species conquered the others, but because different kinds of minds learned to work together. The dragons bring 3 million years of accumulated knowledge and wisdom. Humanity brings fresh perspectives, and the willingness to see possibilities where others see only problems. As the ceremony concluded and the formal partnerships were signed, Marcus found himself standing beside Velthara, the dragon who had first communicated with him aboard their ship. The ancient being had chosen a form roughly humanoid in shape but clearly not human scales that shifted through the spectrum of visible light. Eyes that held depths of knowledge accumulated over eons. Asterisk, patterned singer. Asterisk, Velthara said, the communication flowing directly into Marcus's mind. Asterisk. Do you understand the magnitude of what you have accomplished? Asterisk. I solved a translation problem, Marcus replied. Other people are building the future. Asterisk. You did something far more significant than translation. Asterisk, Velthara corrected. Asterisk. You proved that wisdom and advancement are not the same thing. You showed that sometimes the newest voice in the conversation has the most important things to say. Asterisk. Marcus looked out over Earth's horizon, where dragon ships now moved alongside human vessels in patterns that would have been impossible months before. What happens now? Rond. Asterisk. Now we learn together. Asterisk. Velthara replied. Asterisk. We combine dragon knowledge with human intuition to explore possibilities that neither of us could achieve alone. We discover what the universe becomes when ancient wisdom meets fresh perspective. Asterisk. As the sun set over the Institute's main campus, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The ridicule had ended not when he proved himself worthy by alien standards, but when he proved that human standards had value too. The boy who had been dismissed as a primitive curiosity had become the bridge between humanity and the galaxy's oldest civilization. But more importantly, he had helped prove that every species, no matter how new or different, had something unique to contribute to the greater understanding of existence itself. In the end, the most profound discovery wasn't about dragon communication or advanced technology. It was about the realization that diversity of thought was the most powerful force in the universe, and that sometimes the most important breakthroughs came from the minds that others had dismissed as impossible. The galaxy would never be the same, and it all started with a human boy who refused to accept that some things couldn't be understood.